Welcome to our September Green Breakfast. I'm Trish Beth. I'm the Communication and Programs Specialist with the Northern Virginia Soil and Water Conservation District. Helping me today is Ashley Palmer, who is our Education and Outreach Specialist. In case you have not used Teams before, let me just really quickly go over the tools you have at the top of your screen that you might want to use during this presentation. If you would like to drop something into the chat, that's the leftmost button with the bubble with the little speech lines. You can put questions in the chat during Dr. Luther's presentation, and we'll keep track of those, and we will ask him some of those at the end. There will also be time for questions at the end when he's all done. There's a raise hand button. If we get to the end of the talk and you have a question that we did not answer during the question time, go ahead and raise your hand. You can push that. There's a react button. If you are just loving everything that he is saying, which is entirely possible and likely, you can put a little heart in there. I think that is probably your mic button and your camera button, and I think you're probably all familiar with. So those are the tools you'll probably need today. If you could keep your mics off, that would be helpful. Cameras on is fine. You can unmute mics to ask questions at the end of Dr. Luther's talk. I do want to mention, we sent out a survey asking for ideas for topics. If you were on our Green Breakfast email list, you should have gotten a survey, very short, one question. So if you have any ideas that you would be willing to share with us about what you would like to see us cover in a Green Breakfast, we would love to hear from you. So I know it went out through our email list, our Green Breakfast email list. If you are not on that, we can probably put that link in the chat. What do you think, Ashley? So you could join the Green Breakfast email list with that link. It also, I think, Fairfax Master Naturalist resent it out as well. So thank you for that. Please let us know what ideas you have for Green Breakfast topics. So let me now introduce the reason you are here is to see Dr. Luther. He is an associate professor of biology at George Mason, and his teaching and research interests focus on animal behavior, ecology, and conservation biology. He runs Luther Lab at Mason, where he and his students investigate how species respond to their surrounding environments and alterations to those environments, and just some fascinating research going on at Luther Lab. So I know that this is going to be a very interesting presentation, and I will not take up any more time. We'll let Dr. Luther take it.
Thank you for that introduction. Wonderful. Yeah, I was excited for this opportunity when you asked me, Trish, that this is kind of a new line of research for me, thinking about how through the transportation networks we have in the world, and we use them for so many important things, right? For our daily lives, for transportation of goods, whatever it may be, how they impact the areas around them. And started thinking about this and some other lines of research in terms of ways we can be proactive about some of the human-caused effects on the world around us and maybe mitigate those things. So there's a little bit of pessimism here, but sprinkled with a lot of optimism about ways we can go forward and do better as well. So maybe we've all seen this familiar sight if we've been driving. Some animal scurries in front of the road in front of us at night, right? Or during the daytime. Very common thing. In fact, hundreds of millions to billions of animals any given year succumb to road collisions. And this is a paper we're about to submit. We're taking a global look at all this stuff. You can see in the map here, all the red are where the roads and train tracks are, and all the blue are the shipping lines. The broader, wider the lines, or the brighter the color, the more frequent the traffic is on it. And we've got, just for perspective on this, we've got in the world, as an estimate, 54 million kilometers of roads, 1.2 million of railways, 1.4 million in shipping lanes. And for context on that, you could drive around the Earth on roads 1,350 times at the equator, the long way, right? You could drive to the moon and back 740 times, and we could get a third of the way to the sun if we had all these roads just in one line. So we got a lot of road. And we use it for things, right? But that also, from an ecological standpoint, disrupts a lot of those habitats where it used to all be connected. Now there's this linear path that's going through it that might or might not cause problems for the animals and others around them. Um, and so, in terms of that, I was thinking this in the context of how does that affect wildlife, right? And biodiversity. And in particular, I'm thinking about vertebrate species, terrestrial, well, actually, marine or terrestrial, anything from whales to lizards to snakes to mammals, monkeys, armadillos, whatever. And according to the IUCN Red List, so they assess all the species in the world and assess their threat status, which ones are doing better, worse, and what those potential threats are. They estimate that over 2,311 different vertebrate species, terrestrial and marine, aquatic, are affected negatively by this. And over about half of those, 1,000 of them are already globally threatened species for one reason or another. Um, so this can have a big impact on species that are already kind of teetering on the brink. And so just to put this into context for us a little bit, I'm going to talk mostly about direct collisions of cars ships to some degree too, but I focus on the terrestrial more today. The effects of this on wildlife and on humans, but it also has other impacts besides just hitting those animals. There's a disconnection of that habitat type, which means some won't disperse to find a mate or find food on the other side of the road. The noise pollution can have a big effect in a lot of cases as well, where it prevents animals from finding a mate or not feeding as much as they want to because they're always vigilant and looking out for a predator that they might not be able to hear because of the cars. And then the chemical pollution, the oil and other things that come off of our transportation networks can certainly pollute as well. There is good news. I'm going to try and minimize the depressing bits of this talk here and talk about the good stuff. The really good news is that we can mitigate the majority of these issues, right? We just have to change human behavior a little bit and the way we design these or modify transportation structures. As an example here, these are these deer, there's some fences, and then there's an underpass that instead of going up over the road here as they traditionally would, they can just walk under it and they avoid the cars, right? So there's three main ways one can do this sort of thing. They can, or those who are thinking about this, you can influence driver behavior, you can influence animal behavior, or you can try and just separate the animals from the roads, as this example has here. They have fences, so the animals can't jump up and over up there, and they go under instead. So that's separating them so they don't have the option as much to run across the road. I know this table's a lot. You don't have to take in all of this, but I do want to say amongst those three categories I just talked about, mitigating measures aimed at influencing the driver are these top ones, and there's two kind of categories thinking here. Effectiveness in reducing collisions is this first column, and green is better, higher percent that it's successful than yellow into red. And then the second column here is this effectiveness in reducing the barriers, effects of the roads and traffic as well to those animals. And almost all of these are less good for that, right? In some cases, we might be better minimizing the effect of a driver hitting an animal, but it doesn't always necessarily become effective at helping make connectivity and reducing a barrier for animals so those populations can also thrive. The only case we have down here at the very bottom where we have measures that separate those animals from the roads, where we can get, in some cases, especially if you build like an underpass like I just showed you with the deer, or an overpass, a bridge that goes over for wildlife, in addition to fencing that keeps the animals out of the road, we can get 80 to 100% effectiveness at reducing those collisions, which is great. And then also it makes that connectivity for the animals. So in terms of an ecological context, it really helps them to continue to thrive. And so I'm going to focus a lot of the rest of the talk kind of in this area down here, because it seems to have the greatest success so far in a holistic way, not just in reducing the collisions, but also in terms of helping biodiversity and animals to thrive in the wild. And there's some interesting research on this. There's a couple different designs people do where you can, on the left here, an underpass. Like if this was all just concrete road all the way down, they can build like almost a little tunnel for the animals to go through. Or they can build a viaduct, they call it, which has a lot more expanse with a variety of habitat types. Or an overpass, like you've seen these in cities, like a pedestrian overpass over some busy highway, right? Well, this one has vegetation and other things for wildlife to try and be able to connect and go over that. And I'll show you images. But different animals respond differently based on their own natural history and their needs, right? Some animals are fine being out on top in the open, like elk and bears and deer. They're cool with that. But like little small skulky things like skunks or snakes or frogs or weasels really like to be down in these darker places. And so what we can see here, and you don't have to get into the weeds on this, of course, but the thicker the line connecting from one of the pictures to one of the animal silhouettes means you get the predominance of them going in that type. So like rabbits and things really like these viaduct type or the underpass types. Over here, the viaduct, you get the deer will use them. The larger carnivores like coyotes and things will use them. Some of the small carnivores like weasels will use them. Whereas the overpass, it's only a couple animals. We really see the carnivores and the big deer and things, but not so much a lot of the other groups will use them. So it's good to keep in context for those managers designing these things. You know, what are the target species we're thinking about in terms of what design might be most appropriate? And then this isn't so much an issue here in Virginia, but when you go to tropical countries, there's a lot of animals that just live up in the trees, right? Monkeys and some of the squirrel species, not ours as much, but some of them, like this down here is a squirrel in Japan, they built one for. They have certain mice in England they've built them for to come underneath the they have tunnels for, but certainly in like Africa, Asia, Southeast Asia anyways, and Central and South America, they build these. Here's a road and here's an overpass they built down in the Amazon where they've built these and they can see the animals going across them from different monkey species to loris in Southeast Asia and lots of other stuff, porcupines, other things that really aren't comfortable coming down to the road. Even if it was safe, they feel too vulnerable and they don't go there very often. And when they do, they often get hit by a truck or something. So this is a different strategy I won't talk about as much, but worth pointing out because also useful based on the context of the animals that are becoming victims to roads. Um, okay, so a little bigger picture context, focusing more just centrally on the US here. There's over 1 million wildlife vehicle collisions per year in the US. Costs about $8 billion for these things in terms of insurance, in terms of damage to people and their property, their cars and stuff. Tens of thousands of people are seriously injured each year, and there's a fair amount of mortality, although not as high, fortunately. For people, the animals are almost always killed as well. One good news topic on this is in 2021, a bipartisan infrastructure law from the federal government. As a small portion of that big law there was money in there for wildlife crossing program to help reduce this wildlife collision and improve habitat connectivity for animals. And this started well before it, but now there's a lot more money where they've built over 1,000 wildlife passages over or under US roads to try and mitigate this. In some cases, they build little things for salamanders that I'll talk about. In others, it's for bigger things like moose and bears that are going to cause a lot of damage to people, as well as them getting hurt. And so the best solutions for these, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in detail here, are really ones that are very cost effective in terms of, because it is, dollars, tax dollars that are being used for this. So you want to use them wisely. But they're cost effective at reducing those collisions, but also provide that connectivity without risk for animals. So they can still flourish on both sides of a road instead of that being the new barrier and property boundary for them. And according to Bridget Donaldson, who's been a leader in this field, is right here working for the Virginia Department of Transportation, who's done several studies on this, and says when you do it right, you end up reducing the animal vehicle collisions by up to 90%, which is safer roads for drivers for sure. And you get the costs back if you're building some of these over underpasses with some fences with them. Within 2 to 4 years, you can actually recover all the costs of that construction if you weigh the costs of the collisions and the cleanups and the injuries and hospital bills and all that stuff compared to the cost of the fencing and things. So it can be very cost effective if done well and in the right locations. Um, to zoom in a little bit more here, I'm going from broadest possible, like driving to the sun, all the way down into us in Virginia. Virginia is actually the ninth worst state for wildlife vehicle collisions out of the 50 states. You can see it based on the darker the color, the worse the state is for this. It's 1 out of 78. And this is according to State Farm Insurance collision data that they go state by state on this. And we'll zoom in on that a little bit more, right? So this is from 22 to 2023, those years, animal collision likelihood by state. And it was very high for Virginia relative to the majority of states. And with that, Virginia drivers crashed into wild creatures, crossing roadways over 80,000 times in 2022. Each deer collision costs an estimated $41,000 in state and or personal costs. Black bear collisions are on the rise because bears are actually bouncing back and doing a bit better. And now that we have elk in the southwest corner of the state, due to recent reintroduction programs, elk collisions are up in that area as well. And it's a bigger animal, costs go up with that, upwards of 80,000 per cost. And obviously the animal dies with all these things. These are costs to us as people and taxpayers and so forth. So there's some real dollars involved with this too, not just let's save Bambi sort of stuff. It's a little bit of both. And we're trying to find those win-win solutions with all these things. Good news is Virginia has been taking some action on this, right? In 2020, there was a bill passed where they wanted a wildlife corridor action plan, basically to identify barriers to wildlife movement and then maybe mitigate for that so we get fewer of the bears up here on the road and instead going under or over that road where they won't be hit by a car. In 2021, the state directed agencies to come up to incorporate that plan into all their actions. So building these corridors into this thing they all call WCAP. In 2023, we had our first version of that plan was completed, which I'll expand on here a little bit because it's pretty fundamental to all things happening with Department of Transportation and new structures going forward. And in 2023, we got one of the first federal wildlife crossing pilot program grants to address because we had this corridor action plan in place, we got a lot of federal money to go ahead and implement more of these crossings, which was great. And then actually the state passed a wildlife corridor grant fund from state funds too to help put more resources into this once the right places are identified. So good news there, Virginia's actually trying to help both the drivers, of course, but also, which are voters, but also trying to help the wildlife at the same time, right? Sort of a win-win solution. And through this action plan, we're actually one of the first states east of the Mississippi to pass this. In the West, there have been a lot of states ahead of the curve on this for whatever reasons that is. But good for us. And the intent of this, sorry, getting in the weeds a little bit here, but I think it's important for the big picture in our state, is several intents here. Identify wildlife habitat corridors, identify existing or planned barriers that wildlife movement, so we can incorporate that in future plans. Identify areas of high risk for wildlife vehicle collisions, that's that acronym, and prioritize and recommend crossing projects to mitigate for those potential areas of high collisions. Provide a public portal to host this plan and data, and then update this plan every 4 years. So it's an iterative process. It's not a static thing that, okay, we did that once, assuming it'll never change, because that's the only thing we know in life, right? Change is constant. And with that, so the things I'm talking about now are actually nothing to do with my research as much as touting the wonderful work state and nonprofit agencies within Virginia have done, and then putting in the context of some of the things that I'm doing as well. This is the hub, the connectivity hub. If people are interested in this, is a great resource, and I'll give Trish the link she can share. It pretty much goes through the whole state and all the things the state's been doing on this topic, where the highest impact areas for wildlife vehicle collisions are, how they're trying to mitigate it. You can actually zoom in on maps to like your county and even like your neighborhood within the county to see if it's a high wildlife vehicle conflict area or not. There's a lot of great resources on here. So they did a really nice job. It just came out this year. Wild Virginia in particular put it together, but with funding and help from a lot of different state agencies and other groups as well. But it's worth an exploration if you like this topic at all. And so they came up also with this Virginia Safe Wildlife Corridor Collaborative. Lots of different groups within the state are a part of this, making it work. But really with focus on this topic for increased safety of drivers, but also for wildlife at these roads. And so here's just a snapshot of some of the stuff they got out of this that I'm going to expand upon here in a little bit with research we're doing. And so this is for our state of Virginia. Hopefully you recognize it, right? This is built based just on deer and bear collisions alone. So the things that insurance companies have had reported to them, basically, because if someone runs over a salamander or a house cat or some other thing, they don't really report that as much. That's a speed bump, if anything. But when there's a deer or bear involved, there's, the car gets dented, humans get hurt, these get reported to insurance and so forth. So we can get a better map of where that happened and what it is. So the darker the color of purple and so forth here are the higher areas of vehicle collisions. You can see where we are just east of us, or no, just west of us, sorry. A lot of the roads have a lot of collision areas. And then as you come down along the edge of the mountains down here, there's a lot. And then here in the southeast corner, we tend to get a lot in the east as well, relatively speaking. But that's just the collision. So going forward, if we're thinking about mapping out these areas of really high potential conflicts, they also put, and this is in that connectivity hub, they put together where are the areas where you have the potential best wildlife habitat, and they're most likely to cross these roads as well, right? So we have the purple are the areas of high wildlife vehicle conflict. The green areas are the ones where you're likely to have the most wildlife because it's nature preserves or corridors along rivers or things like that, or national parks and so forth. And so they came up with what they call these nexus areas. But again, this is pretty much all based on just deer and bear data, at least in terms of the vehicle collisions. But still great to have a map of where we think these highest priority areas might be for some sort of mitigation efforts. And some of these things have gone into place already. This is here from Fairfax County, an example. This is out near Fort Belvoir and Richmond Highway area, where they've put a couple underpasses here and they put camera traps on it, and they can see a lot of animals. Like this is a picture of a coyote that I just inserted going through it, but they have herons and beavers and all sorts of other things using these that otherwise either wouldn't go to either side of the road and get disconnected from the rest of the population, or they'd try and cross the road on what's a pretty 286 is a pretty busy road, and there's a high likelihood of becoming roadkill or causing a driver to swerve and then causing an accident and other things as well. Couple other examples. This is down near Chesapeake in the southeast corner of the state, where you have on one side on Highway 17. If you ever drive down to like the Outer Banks, this is one of the main ways people go from our region and the DC area. You have the Great Dismal Swamp, great wildlife habitat on one side, and then this river corridor. And they had a lot of areas of bear collisions coming that were moving along this corridor. So they identified this and they built this underpass here. So the bears can go under it instead of on top of the road. And they said in the first 2 years, they put camera traps on these, they had 550 animal crossing events going under that new underpass that they built there. And that's 550 medium to large size animals that would be going across that road, potentially when cars are coming, and instead going under it. So that increases safety for drivers a lot, and certainly for those animals as well. And I will say this is, I'm sure, an underestimate, because those cameras are only going to get like something like the size of a fox or bigger. Usually they're not going to get the small little salamanders, snakes, rabbits, whatever. They're too small to be detected usually. And then one last example here is this is down near Charlottesville area, this little salamander called the spotted salamander. has a really cool, interesting breeding cycle where part of the year they go to breed in what are vernal pools, pools that are just there temporarily, so fish can't really live in them, and then they dry out. And then they go out into the forest to forage and live for the rest of the year. And so there's these vernal pools over here that they breed in just for like, a couple weeks out of the year. And then over here is where they quite often will go for the forest. And there's this, 4-lane road in between them. And I don't know if you know a lot about salamanders or not. They're small and they're slow, and they have real no protection. So, and they tend to do this migration at night. This is probably only, I don't know, 500 feet, maybe something like that. They go all the way across from here to here. But for a salamander, that's a long ways. And so they would have thousands of them getting squished at night because cars are still going by, and you don't really see a salamander when you're driving, especially if you're going 35, 50, whatever the speed limit is there. Um, so they knew this because locals had reported it, and actually some volunteer groups would go out and like kind of stop traffic a little bit and carry salamanders from one side to the other to try and prevent this. Um, Good diligent volunteers, great. But then what they decided, and they got state to put in this, what looks like just like a sewer grate right here, is actually a salamander passage, where they just dug up a small section of road right in between here and built a little tiny salamander tunnel. Doesn't have to be very deep. Put this grate on top of it, and the salamanders go under it. And they put little fences so the salamanders can't go at other points nearby, little small, short salamander fences. So they're funneled towards this, go under the tunnel. They don't get squished. Now, clearly, this is not a vehicle wildlife collision situation where there's a lot of car damage and insurance claims going, but meaningful for wildlife and biodiversity, which can bring in ecotourism dollars and other things. So useful in that sense for sure financially, but also just for helping other animals persist that otherwise might not, such as this little salamander. But those are just some of the little cases we knew of, right, already. So I want to come back to this for a second, looking at the same map, or looking at based on deer and bears primarily, the big animals that cause damage to cars, because you get a lot more reporting for that. This map pretty nicely shows where these vehicle wildlife conflict areas are. But one thing it doesn't account for is some of the most vulnerable and frankly, less studied species in the state. And so, while I've summarized almost 2/3 of what I've said so far, is really just summarizing some of the great work that a lot of other people have done, state agencies and nonprofits in the state. I want to go forward now a little bit with some research we're just starting, my lab and collaborators at Smithsonian in association with state agencies, thinking about this same framework, but what about some of the most threatened species in the state? Now, if we go back to this, I'll just cut down. So really here, thinking about these two intentions in particular and trying to build upon what's already been done, but thinking about it from the context of specific species that are incredibly threatened with being extirpated in the state or lost from the state of Virginia because they're already declining precipitously, and we know that roads are a threat to them. So prioritizing locations to try and identify where we can mitigate them as roadkill, basically. Um, and so with that, we got some funding from the Virginia Department of Transportation, and this is all in collaboration with researchers at the Smithsonian, Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources, Conservation and Recreation, where we identified 11 species that are of the greatest conservation need in the state of Virginia that are terrestrial species. So we're not thinking about fish and other aquatic ones. Usually they're not roadkill, although the roads can provide barriers if the culverts aren't built right underneath the road, but that's another talk, another day. So terrestrial species and ones that are known to be threatened by roads, like at some part in their life cycle or their life history, they're crossing across these roads and it's a potential threat to them. So I'll go into each species a little bit more here, but here's our list of 11 that they came up with. All of them, I will just point out here, are this species of greatest conservation need, and the tiers are just at what level of threat they are in the state. 1 being the most, and 4 also a high level threat, but not as much as 1 necessarily. Some of them are endangered within the state. Some of them are actually federally endangered species as well. And so I'll introduce those species here, right? So this is one of them. The maybe salamander just lives in the southeast corner area of the state. Um, we have this one, the timber rattlesnake, two populations. One's basically just up in the mountain region. Another one's just in the southeast. Some people call them separate species. I'm not sure that's necessarily true, but definitely distinct because of the habitats and long time separation that they've had. So you have distinct populations, no doubt, and facing different threats from roads and population dynamics as well. Another snake here, they've got the eastern mud snake, again, isolated in the southeast corner of the coastal plain primarily. The common rainbow snake, coastal plain into the Piedmont just a little bit. A spotted turtle, this one is a lot greater portion of the state. A wood turtle only up here, we're at kind of the southern extent of its range, going all the way up to Canada. But here and into West Virginia is most of the region we have it. The northern diamondback turtle, which is kind of an interesting one. It's the only turtle in the world, I think, that lives in salt marshes primarily. And different subspecies and more tropical live in mangroves in Florida, but they'll only be in that saline saltwater habitat of estuaries and salt marshes, which brings up all sorts of different trade-offs of not living in freshwater, but they're only there. So in those systems, we need to think about how they can get connectivity and not have to cross a road. Another turtle, the box turtle, and I mean, this one's everywhere in the state, basically, right? I don't know if you've all seen them or not. I know just in my neighborhood in Fairfax County, in the last 2, 3 years, we've had 4 or 5 events where I or someone else stopped because this thing was crossing the road. And if you know anything about turtles, I imagine you know that they're really, really slow, right? The tortoise and the hare, that old fable and other things. But we would stop, or other cars in front of us would be stopped just even on my street, and it would take it 10 minutes to get from one side to the other. So if someone hadn't stopped initially, other people would just speed right through that thing. And while turtle shells are very hard, and this one in particular is so hard that like a coyote can't even crack into it if it tucks its head and stuff in there, a car sure can pretty quickly, right? um, so a big challenge for this one, and it being everywhere, is roads. And all of these animals have some period in their life where they do a little dispersal or migration from one habitat into another one, where if a road's in the way can cause a problem for it, right? We have a couple mammals in here too. The spotted skunk that lives just up in the mountain regions here, this little thing, and I put in this picture, and this is not just it having fun as much as like actually when they feel threatened, they do a handstand, and then they have these glands back here where they'll spray out all that skunk juice, so they can get higher and closer to whatever it is they're going to spray. So if you see a skunk doing a handstand, that is not when you want to be next to it and say, "Oh, let's take a picture now," because it's about to spray you. Just FYI, and it's only the spotted skunk does that. Sorry, a tangent, but I can't help myself. They have this other one, the Allegheny wood rat, just up in the mountains up here. And then the last species is the fisher. Sorry, these maps get less and less good because we know less and less about these species as we go into it. This one primarily lives up in the north, but it's been in all of its range, northern US that is. It's been facing serious declines. It's only in this northwest corner of the state as far as we know, but it used to be in all of the mountainous regions of the state. And it seems to be coming back a little bit. Which is good news, but then more and more collisions are possible because of that. So this is actually a type of weasel, the largest weasel in North America, other than the wolverine, which just lives up in northern Canada and Alaska, and a little bit in like Wyoming, Montana. And they climb trees a lot, as well as on the ground. Okay, so those are our species. I just wanted to introduce them to you. And actually, I'm getting kind of to the end of a lot of this here for those of you like he talks too much. But what we're doing with all of this is the next level is we're going to start pulling together information about all of these species from natural history, from databases, working with the state government and a lot of data they have about all of them to try and get a sense at one species at a time of what specifically the habitat types they like the most and what is high quality habitat versus not quality habitat. and then looking at where roads intersect with those habitat types, and then pulling in more natural history of whatever happens to be known about how big their territory ranges are, how far they tend to disperse from where they're born to where they set up a territory or try to reproduce later in life. And if we can layer all of that together, we can come up with some sort of resistance matrix to look at the places that they're most likely to try and cross roads and where that's going to be the biggest problem for them, but also for drivers that might be hitting them as well. And so we don't have to get into the technical of all of this, but this is where the modeling comes in. Once we gather all that type of information I was talking about, we'll stack all these different layers on top of each other about roads and habitat quality and dispersal distances and all these other sorts of things, where we can come up with some values based on each given location where roads are intersecting with wildlife habitat areas and others, so that we can come up with values for areas and report this back to the state. And actually, within a year, we're going to do this before the end of next year, so that they can use this for decision-making processes as to where they think they might want to potentially invest money, or at least do follow-up investigations to try and one, help these species, stop them from going extinct, but also help them from being roadkill. Even if they're not causing damage to cars, a lot of drivers might see that small animal and want to swerve out of the way because they don't want to kill it just because. But that swerving could also cause problems if there's another car in the other lane or they hit the barrier on the side, all sorts of other problems. So as trying a holistic view on this for the driver's safety and for the animals, especially those threatened ones in the state, we're trying to bring this all together to report back to the state how best we can move forward with all of this. And we'll actually come up with, so for an example, the eastern mud snake and its areas here, we can come up with an area of where the habitats are, where the roads are, and if they're dispersing only, say, yay far, more or less, the higher values here, as an example, would be where there's really no resistance. They can get there really easily, and there's no problem of roads being a problem. But for ones that are right near a road, sites that might have habitat quality, there's a big problem. There's this barrier this little snake's going to try and cross, and maybe that's a highly trafficked road, causing more of a problem. So the lowest values here could be the biggest problems for where they're trying to disperse. And there's a road that's a conflict, so that the Virginia Department of Transportation and others can look into that and decide if that's a place where it's worth trying to make some sort of mitigation strategy or not. So in conclusion, right, modern transportation systems are certainly having a big impact on wildlife populations, and at a global scale. I didn't get even get into the marine stuff here, but that certainly is happening with ships hitting whales and large sharks and other things too. But there are many mitigation strategies that can account for habitat connectivity and reduce these collisions, and certainly provide economic and ecological benefits as well, even if the economic is less in terms of damage to cars and things of that nature. And the last point here, I think that's great, is Virginia's being proactive about this and right attending to this issue, both for the safety of people, drivers, but also for the our natural heritage in the state. Right, it's ours to look after and take care of because no one else is gonna. So they're being very good about doing that. And this is, I just leave you with this image. This is up in Banff, up in Canada, one of the more famous natural bridges that they've built over highways, running right through the middle of the national park up there, which is a stunning one. If you haven't been, they have these crossings so that, deer, moose, elk, grizzly bears, whatever, don't have to go across this 4-lane highway when these things are going like 70 miles an hour. They can just kind of trance over the top. I will say, though, from personal experience, we went up there many years ago, and if you're driving down this, and it is like 70-mile-an-hour speed limit, if you see a moose or bear up there, it's a little bit of a hazard because you're kind of driving fast and you're looking like, oh, look at that bear way up above, right? But at least you're not hitting it, so that's better. Anyway, I leave you with all of that. There's many people to thank. This is certainly not something that I'm just doing on my own. And I only had 2 or 3 slides at the beginning, but we're about to submit this study about the global impacts on wildlife, both marine and terrestrial, and a lot of different people from WWF, Macquarie University, a couple Australian universities, an aquarium down in Florida, Wild Virginia, Virginia Department of Transportation, Research Council, George Mason University, and others are involved. And then at the state level, we have a lot of state agencies and great people involved, as well as some Smithsonian researchers that are helping make all that research possible. And with that, I will just say thank you, and I'm open to any questions that anyone might want to ask.
Thank you so much, David. That was
Sure.
really, really interesting. I never thought about the overpasses not being accessible to all the different types of animals. You think, like building a bridge over is good for some and building a culvert is good for some. I just thought all the critters would just go. There's an overpass, problem solved. So that was
Right. Well, I think originally a lot of people thought that, right? Just build an underpass, overpass, everything's going to use it. But even the underpasses, the shape of it and how much daylight it gets is really important for some animals. They don't want to go into a dark hole that they can't
right.
see the other side of, right? So they've got all sorts of interesting solutions for widening them, or like in between, if lanes are going in opposite directions, that in between area, they can daylight that area. It brings more sunlight into it and other things that makes it much more inviting to a lot of species as well. So it's a kind of new field, probably only started in the late 90s at the earliest. But they've really started to grow a lot with some of those nuanced components to it.
You are welcome to stop sharing if
I'll
you'd
do that.
like, and we can
Sure.
do questions
Yeah.
in a more face-friendly format. That
Sure.
does lead into a question from Mike, who wants
Sure.
to know, are there smart predators that have realized that this is where all the tasty snacks are crossing and have figured out, like, has it impacted predator-prey relationships in that way? Have they evolved to figure out or adapted to
Yeah.
figure out
That
where
is
to
a
hang out?
great question. And I don't think there's a conclusive answer yet. I think in some cases, anecdotally, absolutely yes. It has happened in some cases, especially when it's some of the smaller animals coming through, like raccoons and other things will sit there and they'll be like, all right, tasty treat. At the larger scale of like a mountain lion waiting for deer, I don't think as much, although anecdotally, there's certainly some evidence of it. I think it's a field that hasn't been studied enough yet to know for sure if systematically that's happening or it's kind of just a one-off event. One individual figures it out, so it kind of does it. Although does it do it all the time? Um, I will say, 500, that one where I put the statistic for the bears near Chesapeake, 550 crossing events in 2 years. While that's wonderful that those didn't go across the road, I don't know that that's enough to just sit and wait all the time for your meals on either, right? Because that's, I don't know how many, my math is failing me, but 365 days in a year, 550 events. It might be. It depends what they're after and if they can still eat that thing when it comes. It's a good question. I think a lot of the ecology around this still needs to truly be figured out about those sorts of things. But we do know for sure that connecting the habitats for these animals is having great ecological benefits in terms of like seed eaters moving from one side to the other and dispersing those seeds, sometimes through their dung and other things, or pollinators moving across. Certainly in the tropics, we've seen a lot of this. And other things they have, then this is more out west, they've seen it or they've done studies on it. Some of these big roads like Highway 40, Highway 10, other things have become barriers to migration events for some of these animals where like if they don't migrate like south of Highway 80 or 40, as the winter comes, they're not going to be in a place where the winter isn't as harsh and they can't survive. So they've had like hundreds and hundreds of mule deer die by the side of the road because they couldn't get across it. It was too big a barrier and they couldn't get to where there's food left because there was too much snow as you stay further north. So in those senses, it's really helping with that connectivity. And for the ones, sorry, long answer, Mike. For the ones where it's huge groups that are moving together at the same time, like hundreds of deer that are migrating together. We don't get that here as much, but out west in the north, they get it. Or those salamanders where 1,000 of them are moving at a time. There's this sort of dilution effect going on where even if a predator is waiting there, like if a raccoon's sitting on the other side and there's 1,000 salamanders coming, it can only eat so many and the rest of them get past it. All right. It'll sit and eat like an all you can eat buffet for shrimp or something. Right. But then at a certain point, its stomach's so big, it just has to just sit down and take a little siesta and the rest of them get past it. Um, so good question. Sorry, I went off on a tangent there.
I just have to say I love hearing you talk because I love like I get new phrases to use like skunk juice and salamander fence and little skulky things, and it's, but I'm not going to go off on that tangent either. You did touch on something. You mentioned pollinators and seed eaters and things, and there were a couple questions. Are you referring to things other than land mammals? Do you do you study the effect on birds, or does anybody study the effect on birds? Let me find the exact
Yeah.
questions. Are you also studying bird collisions with vehicles?
Mhm.
And do road do roads affect birds at all? Or do they just laugh at the land-bound animals?
No, no, absolutely. Right. If we take a global perspective on it, absolutely birds are affected by roads. Well, on a lot of levels, they're affected by roads. But if we're thinking about just collisions, there are many birds in the world that are 99% to 100% terrestrial, and they can fly a little bit, but choose, like, think of the turkey or the bobwhite quail here in Virginia. They can fly, but they really don't choose to ever unless something's about to jump on it. So they're walking across roads all the time. And as you get into tropical places or a lot of islands where species have lost flight, they they depend on crossing roads by foot. So it is a big issue for some bird species. But if you're thinking like the little sparrow, the little warbler, or cardinal, um, it can be an issue, but it's not a huge threat to them. Like if they're flying too low over the road, they can get hit and caught in someone's grill. And I've certainly seen that. I've been down in Burke Center at Safeway and seen like a cardinal stuck in people's grills. They just didn't see it flying. It was flying too low. Shame on that little cardinal. It should know better. I mean, they can fly higher. Why fly that low?
That's Darwinism right there.
I know, right? I got the Darwin
um,
Award that year.
oh my goodness. Ellen asked, sorry, I don't know what's going on here. How is data on road speed that shows reducing speed limits reduces collisions being incorporated?
So does reducing the speed limit help? If people
Basically.
follow it, absolutely yes. There have been a couple road designs I've seen down in, I haven't seen this in the US as much yet. So there's a lot of alternatives here, which are great about modifying human behavior too, not just about doing structures. Um, if people follow these things, it's wonderful. So some of it being, I've seen a couple where they've actually ripped up and redesigned roads to have a lot more curves in them. So people have to go slower. If you just, especially through state and national parks, I've seen that because if it's really curvy, you can't be doing 70. But if it's straight and says 25, if no one's looking, some people are still going to drive 70, right? Not everybody, but some people will. Um, so in those cases, it depends if they're following it or not. Um, but the other thing a lot of places have done is they put up like warning signs, and I'm sure we've all seen that there's that big yellow sign that has a picture of a deer or a bear or a turtle or whatever on it, or a kangaroo if you're in Australia, different things. And some people adhere to that, and some people choose to ignore it. Other places actually have detection monitors in place, and it'll have that same sign and have it flashing when an animal's known to be in the vicinity. Um,
Oh,
and some people will adhere to that and they'll actually slow down. But okay, there's actually a bear nearby. And we can get into details how that's done if you're into the tech side. But and some people will still ignore it, right? It depends how
so
much they're
as with
doing it.
anything, it depends on people actually doing something.
Yeah,
That
there
makes
is
sense.
some really cool stuff with that on the vehicle side of it now because almost all the newer cars have LiDAR built into them. Like I don't know if anyone has reasonably new, I don't know, the last 5, 10 years, where basically it signals if you're doing a lane change, your car knows that and it can detect it, or if you're too close to the car in front of you, it can detect that distance. They've been playing with it with a couple cars where they actually try and model that so that if there's like, well, certainly in like the Teslas, they do it if there's a pedestrian there, it'll tell you and it'll even brake for you to some degree. But they also are trying to tweak it to be like if there's a deer or a moose or some other medium to large size animal, it'll do the same thing and warn the driver and either brake for it or at least have a flashing light inside the control panel there, slow down, there's something here. I don't think that's come out yet, but they're toying with these options as well, which might have more in effect for drivers than if it's, just a sign on the side of the road that we might or might not pay attention to. Sorry, I have long answers for short questions. my
It's okay. We
apologies.
do have quite a few questions. Let me get to another question. John says, when rescuing animals in the road, which I know we're not necessarily endorsing or not endorsing getting out
No.
of your car and rescuing animals, could be dangerous. That being said, I do it too. For turtles, we were all told to keep them going the direction they were going, right? If your
Mhm.
turtle's going this way, when you
Yeah.
move it where it was going, or it'll just keep trying to go the same
Mhm.
direction. Is this true for all animals?
That we should help transport or move them across?
No, specifically, like if you're trying to rescue another type of animal, is that a turtle specific
Mm.
recommendation that you put them where they were headed, or does it not matter
I
as
think
much for
for
other
all of them, they're
critters?
all trying to get there. And I think that in my experience, they're all motivated by some instinct to move in that direction already, whether it's they're trying to find mates to reproduce or it's the whatever their seasonal migration for whatever it is that's like hardwired within them. And I say seasonal migration, like salamanders will only migrate a couple 100 feet sometimes, but it's imprinted. I'm moving from here to here at this time of year every year. And if there happens to be a road in the way, too bad. So I would say, yeah, they all need to move there. So if you are going to enable that movement, and there are a lot of programs in the world that do this, especially with turtles and amphibians like frogs and salamanders, there's a lot of volunteer groups that help move them from this site to this pond, uh, whatever that time of year. Usually, at least for the salamanders and frogs, it's like a 2 week period where thousands of them will be moving from point A to point B, which is usually not very far. And if there's a road in the way, there are volunteer groups. I know of several in different states that go out and actually get like buckets and put them all in it and just walk them across. um, as something, it doesn't get them all, but it's something to help those animals because they're just so compelled not to see them as roadkill.
Glenda asks if you know of any local government actions Fairfax County is doing to address the issue. Because you mentioned some
Um,
state level.
yeah. I know that Loudoun County actually has a very active program on this front, and they're trying to come up with their own strategic plan just for at the county level, where they're identifying these places and talking about implementation and well, and I'm sure seeking state and federal funds to help with it. They have, and on that connectivity hub that I referenced, there's actually a couple really nice slides about what Loudoun County is doing to try and I mean the first step is identify the right spots for it because if you put it in the wrong spot that's not a bad thing but it's kind of a waste of money compared to where it could be much more effective. That's usually the first step is to find the specific location that's best for it. And there's a lot of different ways to do that. We're doing this heavy modeling effect just because we're covering so much ground. What some people do actually is there are these roadkill assessments that people do where they pay people, and a lot of states actually do this, where they remove carcasses from the sides of the roads. Usually it's a Department of Transportation in that state, or some nonprofit they're funding. And they'll do that, and then they'll take GPSs of where all those things are and even identify what species they are that then can go into a database people can refer to see are there certain segments of road that we get more frequently of deer, salamander, whatever it is they're cataloging. I don't know of Fairfax County. It might be. It totally could be. I'm not aware of it if they are. Um, the only two that I know of that I think, and this is just me not knowing rather than what the truth of the matter is, but I think Loudoun and Albemarle County are being proactive at the county level with that. I don't know of any others that are though, but they
She
certainly
also,
could be.
I'm sorry,
Yeah, go ahead.
Glenda also asked about tunnels under paved bike trails for smaller wildlife. Has anybody thought about that?
Yeah, no, certainly there are some. I don't know if it was intended for wildlife or not necessarily, but I know that just from biking a lot in Fairfax County, there are many places where there are underpasses um, for I don't know whatever's going under there. Turtles mostly, the ones I've seen are near wetlandy areas.
Dan asks, a lot of these infrastructure improvements seem to be heavily dependent on roadways, so seemingly any improvements would need to be VDOT managed. Are there things communities can do other than the habitat restoration building activities? Um, And he asked, Dan, maybe you can chime in, data to report to VDOT or researchers on crossings. I'm not sure what the last part of your question is referencing. Sorry, Dan, but if you want to
Oh,
unmute
sorry. I was just thinking about, is there a way if a community sees a crossing, and I think you essentially just answered this. You just mentioned that, there are ways to report crossings and kind of high priority areas where there's roadkill. How can communities get involved outside of the government and initiatives?
Yeah, well, there are, depending what level of involvement you're thinking of, there certainly are some programs where people are trying to collate all the data that comes in, and a lot of it from volunteers and just anecdotal things, whether it's, I mean, I talked about like the roadkill one, but also a lot of people take animals and rescue animals, right, and take them to wildlife rehab areas. If they see something that's hit and hurt, they'll take them there. And quite often, some of the information that they ask for when someone brings them, I don't know, a possum or a bobcat or whatever, a turtle, whatever it may be, is where did you find it and so forth. And so people, and I know Wild Virginia, a nonprofit in the state of Virginia, is trying to get all that information into one big database from all those different wildlife rehab centers to see if they can help identify places then where all these different animals and by species are having bigger issues, right? Can we identify the road segments that are the biggest problems for drivers and for the animals? That then usually to like build something in under overpass, yes, that VDOT has to be intricately involved. And usually DWR and DCR are very involved. Sorry, the state level wildlife resource and conservation agencies are also involved because it's affecting animals that they oversee. But they all have actually been working together really well. I've been in lived in other states where they don't work well together, right? Just the transportation is like, I'm doing this here, get out of my way. But it seems like at least now, I don't know what the past was like in Virginia for this. They're working collectively about, okay, yeah, we have to modify this road or build this road or whatever we're doing. They're consulting with each other to be proactive about how do we, when we're doing that anyways, we've already got all the equipment there. Is this a place we should be modifying the landscape for crossings? And if so, what ways are best? And is it in our budget? Is always a part of it. um, back to your point in particular, Dan, I think that, yeah, with the wildlife rehab centers or just sharing what you've seen or other groups are very involved with those crossing events. Like we salamanders always go from point A to point B, helping with signage or just making it known or helping physically moving those animals are all ways that people have been involved in some neighborhoods and regions. I know where I grew up in California, there was this one little county park that these salamanders always moved across this road for like a 2-week period to go to their breeding area. And after just years and years of them getting squished and squished, but the people lobbied the park so much they actually closed that little road for that 2-week period at night. So no one could drive it at night for 2 weeks. And it just meant, the drive was an extra 15 minutes for people, which some grumbled about, but it saved that was probably the whole population because they all bred here and then they'd go here to eat later in the year. And so little things like that can be useful too if you have a situation of that kind, and it's an option.
That was in California, you said, where that happened?
Yeah, that was out in like near Berkeley, California.
Yeah. One final question, Christy asked if there was any additional legislation you're aware of being considered in Virginia to mitigate collisions that people could maybe let their representatives know they support.
Yes. Well,
and if you're not, that's fine.
No. Well, the last one that I mentioned, that fund for these, I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head. I think they approved it, but it's still sitting in the appropriations committee to actually like put the money into it. They approved, said, yes, we'll put money to it, but they haven't decided how much or when. So that is also a critical part of when you pass a bill, funding that bill, right? So that's a place that someone could put some effort if they are into talking to their representatives about things for sure. Because this is one of those, I think it's one of those big win-win situations. I know a lot of the wildlife conservation types have talked in the past about, we'll do it for the wildlife. But really, this is let's do it so the people don't hit the wildlife and hurt themselves too, right? I mean, sure,
Mhm.
losing a salamander or a porcupine or whatever is bad news, but getting in a car wreck and hurting yourself, damaging your car, that's also really, really bad news. So this affects both of those in really good ways where we can find something, a better way forward.
It's all bad news. It's all lose
Yeah, it's
lose.
all,
I've been fortunate to not hit anything large, but even I think a groundhog is the largest animal that I've had the
yeah,
unfortunate.
you feel bad.
It's traumatic. It's not fun.
It is.
Certainly not fun for the groundhog, but it was not a good day.
It is. Oh,
Um,
I will say I saw someone popped up a chat item there and I didn't see the full question, but iNaturalist, I think they actually do have or are starting like a roadkill program on iNaturalist where one could report things there. Like you just log into their website, you take a picture of whatever it is, and you just upload it to their website. And that geo references, and they even ID the species through iNaturalist and other things too. That then researchers, and in fact, for the project we're starting, we're going to be referring to iNaturalist for a lot of information for these things as well. So great point, whoever put that in the chat.
that was John. Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you, John.
Would anybody else like to ask a question before we wrap up? That I think I've hit everything in the chat, hopefully, but if you would like to not drop, if you would like to unmute and ask David a question, this is your chance. And
Well, thank you everyone for listening. Hopefully it was informative.
it was wonderful. Thank you very much for coming
Yeah.
on a Saturday to present, and it was really informative and entertaining.
Good.
Thank you everyone for coming as well. And our next Green Breakfast will be in November. Hopefully we'll see you there. I hope everybody enjoys the rest of their Saturday.
Cool.
Thank you so
Trish.
much.
Bye.